Hi, everybody. Professor Albert back again with Chapter 2 of The Post-American World by Fareed Zakaria. Took us about 5 minutes to do 5 pages last time, so we're going to go a little more quickly. This time we're looking at Chapter 2, The Cup Runneth Over. And again, this shouldn't suffice for reading. In other words, you should be doing the reading. This is simply to help you get some of this content under your belts to understand what you're reading maybe a little bit before you read it. So you can read along with me, or you can read after you've seen this, or maybe take a look after you've done the reading if you've had trouble. Here we go. So chapter 2 starts on page 6. He begins with a little story, as often authors will. He begins a chapter by saying, let's pretend we ask a sage what's going to happen in the next 7 years, beginning in 2000. And he tells us all these things that, these events. What's going to happen to the economy given all of these events? He says there's going to be a war, there's going to be a attack, September 11th, so forth and so on. And he says, well, the expectation would be that the economy would collapse, but in fact it doesn't. And it's precisely the opposite happens. The economy booms. And so the question becomes, why is that? What he's really trying to do is set up for us this split he sees between kind of what's going on politically in terms of warfare and other things and what's going on economically. The economic engine of the world keeps spinning and spinning and spinning and making more and more people wealthy and better off, even while there's trouble. He then turns, now on page 10, to the Islamic threat. And what he's going to tell us about is what you all know well about the Islamic threat, the supposedly global war on terrorism. And basically, he doesn't think much of it. He says a couple of things. One, he says that Al-Qaeda began by saying we're attacking the Jews and the Americans, and now they're just as happy to attack the Shiites. Those of you that had me for 101, and hopefully in your other 101 classes, know that Islam is divided into Sunni and Shia, and the argument he offers is that the Sunnis and the Shias are too busy fighting amongst themselves to attack the Christians and the rest of the world. He goes on to say that it's not really a global movement, it's a lot of individual movements, and we sometimes mistake or lump together a lot of individual movements into some sort of global jihad. He also argues that a lot of conservative commentators, he says here on page 14, many conservative commentators have written about the impending Islamization of Europe. And he talks about conservative commentators a fair bit and how they have kind of drummed up fear for their own reasons. Okay. He goes on. Let's see. He says approval of suicide bombing is down. He says that actually there's only a tiny minority of Muslims that are jihadists, and that the challenge from Iran in particular is very small. On page 17, the GDP of Iran is 1/68th that of the United States, and its military spending is 1/110th that of the Pentagon. The argument being that it's really not that big a threat. Okay. All of this, by the way, is Zakaria's point of view. I'm not saying I agree, disagree. We'll come to all of that later, and really, its question is, do you agree? Okay, page 18 begins the Great Expansion. And now he's going to explain to us about this economic expansion that's happening, again, despite the calamities in the political sphere. And he says there, again, he likes threes. There have been three examples of this. The first was capital movement in the 1890s, a turn-of-the-century boom that moved capital to the U.S. The second was a capital movement in the 1950s and 60s, and this begins on page 19, and money moved to Europe and East Asia, from the United States to Germany and Japan in particular, but also Korea and other places. And now we are in a third period, period 3. The expansion on page 20. The expansion was spurred by the movement of Western capital to Asia and across the globe. As a result, between 1990 and 2007, the global economy grew from 22.8 trillion to 53.3 trillion. So again, it's a third movement of capital, this one from the Western or developed nations, the United States, Europe, to Asia and all around the globe. The next section, pages 20 and 21, talk briefly about Japan, saying people will say to him, Well, hang on. We were all worried about Japan growing in the 1980s, and that's true. You got a lot of press about this, a lot of media talking about the rise of Japan, and then Japan collapsed, and in the 1990s they had the lost decade. That's discussed in the Wikipedia article, and you should be researching that or looking that up. And he says, actually, that's not a very good comparison because Japan's a developed country and has been throughout the period we're talking. What's going on now is underdeveloped countries like India and China and Brazil and others now rising to the world stage. Okay, page 21. There are three forces: politics, economics, and technology. So we're starting down here. And again, he loves three. Three is a very good number, right? He says, how did all this come to be? How did we get this great expansion? He says we got to go back a few decades. The first point is politics. And he says that in the 1970s, a lot of the world was choosing what was called the middle path. They were the non-aligned or third world nations. You had a choice: capitalist like America, communist like the Soviet Union, or something in between. And a lot of countries, Egypt, India, lots of countries chose to find a middle ground. And so they had semi-controlled economies, much more command-controlled than, say, the United States, but maybe not quite as Soviet as the Soviet Union itself. Okay, not quite as communist as the Soviet Union itself. But beginning in the 1970s, and then really when the Soviet Union broke up in the late 1980s, governments stopped doing that, and they said, look, we're going to go with this market model. We're going to go with capitalism. And he has a great quote by Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain in the 1980s. And it's page 22. As Margaret Thatcher famously put it in the years when she was reviving the British economy, quote, there is no alternative. So there was no longer a middle way, there was only the one way. There was also an ideological shift in economics that had been building in the 1970s and 1980s. He mentions people like what are called Chile Chicago boys, a bunch of Chilean economists who went to the University of Chicago and learned about really pretty fundamentalist capitalism there. And countries like Chile and others went down this path ideologically. They decided that this was a good thing. The financial force, remember his three things here are politics, economics, and technology. So that's politics, a change in the way people are thinking and a change in the political dynamics in these countries. The next thing is a financial force, and that's the free movement of capital. Here we're talking about the ability to take money in and out of a country at will. So if you want to move money from here to England, you can. If you want to move it to China, you can, and out again. That would be a completely free movement of capital. In fact, there are capital controls, especially in countries like China. But those capital controls used to be much more dominant. You used to have a much harder time getting cash, getting currency in and out of a country, getting money to flow across national borders. And increasingly that has changed. He then says on the bottom of page 23, along with freely floating capital, down here, along with freely floating capital came another policy revolution, the spread of independent central banks and the taming of inflation. And this is sort of 2A, or the second part of his second point about economics. You get independent central banks, and that's a little too complicated to go into right now, but we can talk about it certainly in class. And you tame inflation. Hyperinflation, really extreme inflation, where the inflation rate is 20%, 30%, hundreds of percent, has been tamed. That doesn't happen anymore. Even in the U.S., we would have inflation rates over 20%, and now an inflation rate 3%, 4%, 5% is very scary to economists nowadays. Then he talks about technology. So this is number 3, technology. Technology, he wants to talk about communication technology. And he says, look, it's obvious we can get news from around the globe now. What's important to remember is that prices are a kind of news. So the price you're willing to pay for something is now, the price that's being asked for something is being asked all around the globe. People all around the globe know what that price is. And so the markets, which operate on supply